Content warning. This video contains brief mentions of sexual violence, domestic violence, and gaslighting. The rest of the discussion focuses on these issues operating on a systemic level. Hi, I'm Ree, the weird vegan vampire with broken fangs. And yeah, the state of the NHS for dentistry. How am I going to bite things? But anyway, welcome back to the Vampire's Castle. This is a place where feminists plot to destroy the white, able-bodied, cis-male left with their intersectional powers. This is a place where we literally drink the blood of the white working class male. Wait. What? Okay, so what am I on about? Why am I cancelling myself before I even get started by talking about an essay that's over a decade old? And unfortunately, yes, this is written by a man who is no longer here to defend himself, unfortunately, which is one of the criticisms I've heard of why we shouldn't talk about this. But unfortunately, I keep seeing this essay brought up over and over again in online debates, usually about cancel culture, and it's usually brought up in bad faith. Now, often when I do talk to people about the context that this was written in, they do understand, which is why I've decided to make this video, because I feel like you wouldn't necessarily know unless you were involved in very specific parts of the left at a very specific point in time in the UK. Now, Exiting the Vampire's Castle is an essay by a theorist called Mark Fisher, and it essentially calls for a recentering of class in left politics. And it talks about how there's a supposed dominance of educated moralizers who are destroying the authentic working class from the Twitter sphere. Now, I've linked to the full essay below so that you can read it for yourselves. Mostly, I'm going to be looking at the context in which it was written rather than an analysis of the essay itself. There are others who have done this. I will link to those as well. I do firstly want to be very, very clear though. I'm not saying that none of Fisher's writing has any use either before or after this essay, and I am definitely not trying to cancel Mark Fisher. I am aware that Fisher struggled with his mental health quite intensely. I also struggle with my mental health, and through my research I'm aware that a lot of leftists did and do. And mental health and disability in Marxist theorists and revolutionaries is something that I want to look at in depth in future videos. But back to this essay. I would love to never have to discuss the Vampire's Castle again. Completely done with it. We should all be able to move on. However, thanks to certain media outlets, this essay is now popping up over and over again. And it's usually posted by people outside of the UK who aren't aware of the context in which it was written. And whilst I felt that this essay was very harmful at the time, there were counter discussions. I don't feel that this is the case now. It's like this essay just won't go away. It's a really deeply anti-feminist text with lots of gothic metaphors in it, which is something that I really liked about Fisher's writing until it was weaponized against anyone bringing up an issue that wasn't simply class and class alone. It was used to imply that feminists are inherently blood-sucking liberals. And I feel that this essay has kind of become undead in its own right and continues to cause harm. Now, it's very easy to read this essay as being a very legitimate critique of online culture and foreshadowing how cancel culture would become. However, knowing the context that this was written in, I really don't think that that's what The Vampire's Castle was about. It's almost never brought up to defend a person it's never brought up when a marginalised person is receiving a disproportionate level of online harassment. It is always used when somebody criticises a cis-out white dude. Now, I can see how reading it, people would think that he had a point. So let's explore it. Let's go back. Hey, it's me again. I've just had to redo my makeup because I had to go to the dentist and it was really stressful and they can't fix my fangs for ages. Yeah, that's a bit of a pain. But anyway, back to Mark Fisher's essay, Exiting the Vampire's Castle. Now, I want to have a look at what Fisher actually said in the essay and then go on to discuss the context and the things that were going on around the time that he wrote it. So he begins by talking about how he's fed up with the left, he's fed up with organising and all the fallouts that are happening. So he's describing his experience at an event to organise a new campaign, and he's seeing some people giving prominent left-wing think people, I guess, / journalists. So the brain fog got me there, never mind, reloading my thoughts. Yeah, he's talking about how he's seeing the journalist Owen Jones getting a lot of backlash from feminists for his defence of the comedian Russell Brand, who made some, pretty misogynist remarks and did some not so great things. Fisher's Fisher's defence of Russell Brand is that he's a working class man, and some of these things are just things he brought up with, and that feminists are being quite snobbish, and it's overly educated middle class response in his opinion. Now, a lot of people did agree with that kind of understanding of how things were with this particular comedian, and his whole persona was being a man of the people. But honestly, like a decade later, it's not like Russell Brand has turned out to be a particularly great person for social justice. A lot of people did find themselves disappointed in some of the things that he's been saying. In the video, Should We Transcend Ideology by Mica, the channel's called Ponderful, she discusses more about the current day problems with Russell Brand. But yeah, anyway, at the time it was being regarded as being something that people should just get a pass on if they're working class. Anyway, let's have a look at what...
We need to learn, or relearn, how to build comradeship and solidarity, instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. This doesn't mean, of course, that we must always agree. On the contrary, we must create conditions where disagreement can take place without fear of exclusion and excommunication. This summer, I seriously considered withdrawing from any involvement in politics. Exhausted through overwork, incapable of productive activity, I found myself drifting through social networks, feeling my depression and exhaustion increasing. Left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms in which particular left-identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable, but nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue. The stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. The reason I didn't speak out on any of these incidents, I'm ashamed to say, was fear. The bullies were in another part of the playground. I didn't want to attract their attention to me. The open savagery of these exchanges was accompanied by something more pervasive, and for that reason, perhaps more debilitating, an atmosphere of snarky resentment. The most frequent object of this resentment is Owen Jones, and the attacks on Jones, the person most responsible for raising class consciousness in the UK in the last few years, were one of the reasons I was so dejected. If this is what happens to a left-winger who is actually succeeding in taking the struggle to the centre ground of British life, why would anyone want to follow him into the mainstream? Is the only way to avoid this drip feed of abuse to remain in a position of impotent marginality?
Okay, so you could read this and, quite easily think that he had a point. Online politics, particularly intra-left politics, can get very intense and very toxic, especially when it's around issues of inclusion and accessibility. However, when we look a bit more closely at the rest of the text, it becomes more clearly anti-feminist and anti-intellectual, and those aspects do become more clear. So Fisher outlines what he calls the rules of the vampire's castle and how he feels that it functions and operates. So if we have a look at his descriptions of this.
The first configuration is what I came to call the vampire's castle. The vampire's castle specialises in propagating guilt. It is driven by a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first to be seen to spot a mistake, and a hipster's desire to be one of the in crowd. The danger in attacking the vampire's castle is that it can look as if, and it will do everything it can to reinforce this thought, that one is also attacking the struggles against racism, sexism and heterosexism. But far from being the only legitimate expression of such struggles, the vampire's castle is best understood as a bourgeois liberal perversion and appropriation of the energy of these movements. The vampire's castle was born the moment when the struggle not to be defined by identitarian categories became the quest to have identities recognised by a bourgeois big other. The second libidinal formation is neo-anarchism. By neo-anarchists, I definitely do not mean anarchists or syndicalists involved in actual workplace organisation, such as the Solidarity Federation. I mean, rather, those who identify as anarchists, but whose involvement in politics extends little beyond student protests and occupations and commenting on Twitter. Like the denizens of the vampire's castle, neo-anarchists usually come from a petty bourgeois background, if not from somewhere even more class-privileged.
So, he's dismissing feminist arguments by making assumptions about people's class and their class backgrounds, and he's also making assumptions about where dissenting ideas in academia actually come from. So he's just very dismissive of student activism. Sorry, this is Mica. He's probably going to be in quite a few videos. Come on. You can't see him at the moment, but when he turns around you might notice his eyes are a bit cloudy. He's blind, and basically whenever he hears voices and chatters or online lectures, he comes and listens. So, He's got about 1 million nicknames as well. But yeah, I'll try and get back to discussing the essays. Like I said, he's making a lot of assumptions about people's class backgrounds and about how discourse in the academy works. He's dismissive of student activism and talks about, a layer of anarchists being very bourgeois in their behaviour. What's interesting about that is that one of the anarchist organisations that he names is Solidarity Federation, and they were definitely present in some of the student occupations and protests and everything around that, and students were getting involved in the communities and making links with problems that academic staff were facing and putting those into occupation demands and things like that. So it's definitely not a separate. He's listening to me. But someone is. No, it's so he starts. He's incredibly dismissive of student activism. This was written in 2013, so there'd been a couple of years of activism building up around education, because it was the time where the Conservatives had gone into coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and the Liberal Democrats had campaigned on the basis that they were going to scrap tuition fees, and when they made a coalition with the Conservatives, they immediately put the fees up and agreed to it. So there was a lot of things happening around those few years, but also a lot of things were bubbling in the background. People started speaking out about gendered violence within the left, because a lot of things have been happening within organisations, and people had had enough, as you would. So yeah, a lot of people had become a lot more interested in feminist organising and feminist politics and history as a result of some things that had gone on with some of the left-wing groups in the UK. I'm aware that these problems happen around the world. It's just talking about those ones because these ones are the ones that had happened shortly prior to the time that Fisher wrote this essay. So there's a group called the Socialist Workers' Party, and a member of them had allegedly raped more than one person, and they'd had an internal investigation within the group that people felt hadn't been handled very well. There was also a group called the Socialist Party. These groups still exist, by the way. A senior member of the Socialist Party had allegedly been violent to his partner. He was also a prominent activist in the RMT union as well. Now, there were other things going on as well, other cases that can't be talked about for legal reasons, but in these situations, people did put things in the public sphere in the cases that I'm talking about. Now, there's a couple of things at play here. So all this is bubbling away and making people realise how urgent it was to have feminist organising within the left. Now, both groups were accused of cover-ups, in particular the Socialist Workers' Party, because so much came out into the public about how the party had handled it. Now, there's a lot in Sarah Ahmed's book called Complaint, that talks about gendered violence in the workplace and sexual harassment and what happens to people who complain about this. And she looks at this both from the perspective of students, like a lot of their interviews were interviewing students and staff members who had various experiences around putting in complaints. And she talks about how the processes and the structures for handling complaints very much serve to stop voices being heard and to stop complaints getting anywhere. And she talks about the consequences for people on having made complaints. Now, I would recommend all of Sarah Ahmed's reading. Yeah, a lot of her work is very relevant to these issues. But I think her writing makes it very clear that this problem within the academy is both a workplace problem and a problem for students. And I think that it's also quite similar to what happens within structures around complaint within a workplace, often have similarities and overlaps to how they work within a political party. Particularly in the case of the Socialist Workers' Party, because they have a lot of prominent academic members. And Sarah talks about how these the consequences of making complaint can lead to often explicit threats of loss of networking, a loss of opportunities, loss of potential for your career or for your academic pathways. And I think that's quite relevant in the case of the Socialist Workers' Party, because the person who these accusations were made against, they called Comrade Delta.
So I appear to have lost a bit of footage. You may have guessed from the name, the spoony name. I do have an energy limiting disability, so I'm unfortunately unable to reshoot that right now. But I'll just continue from where that stopped. The party member who the accusations were against, Comrade Delta, was given a funded PhD place with teaching hours in a university, and there was a campaign against that happening. I'll link to the Libcom article that discusses that in more detail, but my point was that it fits with Sarah Ahmed's discussions about loss of opportunity for those who complain, because it actually shows how people who cause harm in organisations are actually protected by their friends and their contacts. So I think this fits with that.
So all of this stuff that was happening led to a lot of activists getting quite interested in feminism and the concept of intersectionality in particular. And intersectionality is a theory that comes from actual critical race theory, not what the moral panic is about. Now, intersectionality was coined by a theorist called Kimberly Crenshaw, and she was talking about the things that happen to Black women within the legal system and how the different parts of their different identities intersect to affect their outcomes and positions in society. This isn't a concept that was taught much in UK institutions at the time. It wasn't something that, as Fisher claimed, was being fed to people from bougie academia. It's a it's a concept that you probably would find on most sociology courses now, definitely at postgraduate level, but also it's not a really complex theory in the sense that people can't self-educate, which is something that I think Fisher misses really when he's talking about class, because at the time a lot of students were feeling their awareness that they may well be, some of the last layers of working class people to be able to get a university education. People do still do it now, but it was certainly made a lot more difficult. And it's also a bit strange to me to be against the idea of people educating themselves on social issues and social theory, regardless of what job you do for money. Understanding how society works isn't something that should be kept from the working classes. But anyway, yeah, it wasn't really taught that much in UK institutions. I used it a fair bit in my dissertation that was looking at similar issues of gender in the left. But as with most other people talking about this in the UK, this relied on a lot of information that I'd come across via the internet, or at least where to look for the sources. So yeah, a lot of this information did come from the so-called Twitter sphere, or as Alex Kalinikos from the Socialist Workers' Party called it, the dark side of the internet. So yeah, anyway, because people were feeling the urgency to get safer spaces implemented, there was a lot of discussion of this within different left organisations, and so various things were getting written. I was in a group called the National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, and there was a discussion within this group about the fact that a candidate for the National Union of Students was a member of the SWP, and the remaining members of the SWP were not being particularly friendly to people wanting, or people talking about why these issues should be dealt with. So yeah, there was a discussion with a group that were new at the time at Left Unity, and the Socialist and the Communist Party of Great Britain. In their paper, The Weekly Worker, they wrote an article called Playing It Safe, in which they referred to the idea of safer spaces as zombie Maoism. But yeah, so I want to look at an essay that's also by Sarah Ahmed. It's called Against Students. Now, in this essay, she talks a lot about safer spaces and the importance of safer spaces, both from the position of within the classroom. So a lot of the essay is, I'll link to it, but a lot of it is about racism in the classroom and how course content changes through people making demands, really. And she talks about how this often gets dismissed as consumerism, and how often acting in ways that are trying to make things more radical in a positive way often gets talked about in terms of being consumerist or being managerial. If you in any way use the institutions to make change, it's quite easy to get dismissed in terms of helping capitalism along. And so all of this gets entangled up in arguments about students being consumerist and not understanding class, and the arguments about decentering class, I feel, are argued very strongly against in both this essay and Filar's essay, which Sarah references in Against Students. Filar's essay I will link to as well. Now, this essay is explicitly in response to Exiting the Vampire's Castle. But Sarah Ahmed references it in the end part of this essay Against Students. So the first part of it is about how accusations that get made against students in regards to issues like making the classroom a safer place get dismissed as managerialism. And a lot of that isn't my place to talk about, because that isn't anything I'd experience. But I'm going to look at the last part of the essay, because I think she's talking in agreement with Filar, and also bringing in a lot about how gendered violence within student concerns are also similarly dealt with and impact on feeling safe within a workplace. She's arguing very much in defence of students here, but in her other work, you can clearly see it's a workplace issue as well. So we're going to look at this last part of Sarah Ahmed's essay, because she's particularly making a very strong rebuttal against the accusations that get made about students and student concerns and activism, and how they get dismissed. So look at
The words moralism and puritanism are constantly being mobilised in anti-feminist writings. These words are useful because they allow a critique of power to be reframed and dismissed as an imposition of moral norms. We could consult, for example, Filar's smart challenge to an anti-feminist diatribe in which the word moralism is used 9 times. It is an exhausting repetition, and these are often the words used by harassers themselves, as if to refuse an advance is to be moralising. She says no because she is a prude, say. If you refuse an advance, or if you dare to call repeated and unwanted advances harassment, you are being moralistic. Surely not, you might say. Just take this account of the introduction of laws on sexual harassment. We see the old Victorian moral panic in the guises of political correctness and strictures on sexual harassment. In this piece of writing, sexual harassment is referred to twice, and both times as a kind of moralism that restricts freedoms that would otherwise be enjoyed. The introduction of sexual harassment as a stricture as intending that restriction. We are looping back to a starting point, how equality is dismissed by being identified with managerialism, with the imposition of moral norms from the top down. Feminism is then aligned with management, as a technique for managing unruly bodies, just as feminism can be aligned with the market as a consequence of unruly bodies. Not surprisingly, the techniques for dismissing feminism are the same techniques for justifying male power. Of course, what has to remain unsaid here is this: the freedom of some rests on the restriction of the freedom of others. So much harassment is justified and reproduced by framing the very language of harassment as an imposition on freedom. And so much violence, such as domestic violence, is not called violence because it is understood as a right and a freedom. It is not violence, it is not force. I have a right to your body. You're up against history, walls. When sexual harassment becomes embedded in or as academic culture, then we are talking about how some women do not have access to universities even after they have applied and been admitted. Sexual harassment is an access issue. Sexual harassment is an equality issue. Sexual harassment is a social justice issue. We are talking about women who have to exit the institution to survive the institution. We are talking about missing women. I have become more and more aware of what we are talking about, of who we are talking about. We could and should refer to the important blog Strategic Misogyny, which collects stories of harassment within universities. We need to hear these stories, to listen to their collective wisdom. Different posts describe in detail what harassment can feel like and what it can do, and we learn how power might function by not being dispersed. We are reminded when we read these posts of the immense power that academics have over students. They grade student essays and exams. They have discussions about students in meetings that are closed. They sit on committees that decide funding. They have access to confidential files that hold personal information. It is very important to recognise power over as a modality of power. It is in this context that we must question the constant exercising of the language of consent and its companion, will. If the person who is asking for your consent holds power over you, in effect, a power to decide a future, whether a door is open or not, what does it mean to give or withhold consent? I am not saying here that all consent is coercion, but that consent in the context of asymmetrical relations of power is not a stable ground for establishing whether or not an abuse of power has occurred. It is because some have power over others to open or close that door that we need boundaries, rules and norms. So much abuse of power within universities is justified by the illiberal use of the liberal language of will and consent. As I argued in Willful Subjects, some might become willing when the costs of not being willing are made too high. Being unwilling might mean being expelled from a group that would allow you to access the resources necessary for your survival, let alone progression. Being unwilling might mean being called frigid, or worse still, a feminist. These names have costs. Becoming willing might be a way of avoiding these costs. We have a sense of what is going on here. Challenges to sexual harassment within universities can be swept up and swept away, as if the challenges are themselves the product of managerialism or neoliberalism. It's just another way that academic freedoms have been restricted, just another way that academic dissent is punished. The power embedded in the historical teacher-student relation is reversed. We have a sense of what is at stake here. Critiques of neoliberalism and managerialism become useful tools for those who abuse the power they have. Those who are accused of harassment can argue, or at least imply, that students who challenge their practices are acting like consumers, being censoring, oversensitive, or just complaining. They can position themselves as victims of managerialism as well as marketisation. A critique of neoliberalism can be used to imply that those accused of harassment are the ones who are paying its costs. This is how harassment can be justified as an expression of academic freedom. That is where we are. That is what we are up against. We need to support, stand with, and stand by those students who are fighting to survive hostile institutions. It is our job.
So yeah, there's obviously so much going on, and you know, online discourse around that time did get very intense. But I hope that what I've looked at and discussed shows that often there is a good reason for that, and a person that's needing to be heard. And I guess that's how discourse works in a way. You know, people speak out, and there's a backlash. Sometimes some understanding is. Sorry, can you hear that? Sorry, my tinnitus has been really bad lately. I'm sorry, I thought I could hear something. But yeah, no, the discourse can get incredibly scary. But no, the discourse can definitely get incredibly intense and tiring, drawn out, feeling never. I'm just gonna go see what that is. Hello?
Sexism is working class.
No.
This is exactly like the witch hunt.
Look. No. This is a safe space.
Hey. Safest race is a zombie marathon.
No.
Hey, what about false accusations?
I am not staying up all night arguing with the discourse. Go away. I'm just finishing my breakfast. I was up all night arguing with the discourse, you know, going exhausted. Yeah, you know, Twitter discourse, especially left-wing Twitter discourse, is a horrible, horrible place. I just really don't believe that the people who usually get the blame for it are the ones at fault. The thing is that reactionaries are always going to be reactionary, and we do get left-wing reactionaries too, and those speaking out against it will prompt a backlash, and so it just becomes a mess. I just don't believe that this doesn't ever have a connection to real world politics. It's very often the case that it's people who really, really need to be heard who are speaking out against this. Also, it's really no surprise that a lot of the anti-intellectual left have picked up on this essay because it does serve their purposes very well. Now, there are themes throughout it about postgrad students, university students, and how everything is, you know, so over academic, when that isn't really the case. You know, I did talk a bit about how intersectionality as a concept wasn't really big in UK universities at the time, and as is the case with most theories getting into academia, they come from activists first. They're often co-opted. I don't believe it was the case with this, but a lot of theories that come from working class movements do get studied in the academy. The idea that it's primarily a bourgeois thing just really doesn't sit right with me, especially coming from a writer who taught in further education. Because up until quite recently, further education colleges in the UK were the route into academia for working class students. And yes, a lot of that's being taken away, and it's a terrible situation. And Fisher does talk about that in the book Capitalist Realism, which is actually what I was referring to when I said that not all of his writing should be disregarded because of this essay. However, after arguing with the discourse all night, I decided to have a little read over it, and I have to say that, again, a lot of this anti-academic rhetoric is present in that, and also, unfortunately, quite a lot of things that just cannot be read any other way as being a dig at neurodivergent students. So yes, grab that. Sorry. Okay, so one of the criticisms the left often get, especially, the more what often get dismissed as identitarian left, is that we're moralising and overly critical of working class people who don't understand theory. I'm not saying that Twitter can't be a horrible place. It really is. The discourse gets incredibly out of hand, gets toxic. However, that is usually directed at marginalised people speaking their truth in ways that seek to build solidarity with other oppressed people. And they don't always get it right. For example, yes, some people completely focus on gender and class, or disability and class, and will ignore race or ignore disability or anything like that. So I'm not saying that every single person who spoke out about feminism at that time is necessarily not engaging in this toxic behaviour towards other oppressed groups. But the arguments being brought about were not about destroying solidarity or doing capital's work for it, as claimed. And I really do wish that this essay would go away. This video is dedicated to everyone who has experienced abuse, harassment and exclusion within the left, in academia and in other workplaces and society in general. Solidarity. There's some people that I'd like to thank for various levels of involvement, either helping me as voice actors, putting up with meltdowns, technical advice, helping me get things that I needed for this. Obviously, what I've managed to pick up is no reflection on the technical skills of those who've helped, but thank you nonetheless. So those people are The Discourse, Sarah Clark, the human behind Without History, another awesome person who knows who they are, Kim Crawley, Kaylin Conrad and Bobby Count. Thank you. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe so you'll get a notification when I post my next video. If you'd like to support me making future videos, I'll link to my Patreon in the video description. Thank you.